rain had always carried a certain weight in my life. Some people describe rainfall as cleansing, a natural lullaby, or a gentle backdrop for sleep. But for me, storms never felt like that. Even as a child, I could never shake the uneasiness that came with heavy skies and endless dripping. It was as if the world was trying to tell me something each time. The clouds split open, poured themselves onto the earth. A warning, maybe. A reminder that beneath the noise and the rhythm of the storm, something was watching. That night, the night that changed everything, the rain came harder than ever before. The kind of rain that blurred the lines between the sky and the earth, that drowned out even the sound of your own thoughts. The gutters overflowed. The glass panes shivered with each gust of wind. My house was nothing special, just a modest red brick single-story, sitting quietly among other suburban homes. And yet, as the storm pressed down against it, it felt like the house had shrunk, leaving me smaller and more vulnerable inside. The air was damp and heavy, sticking to my skin like a second layer. I had turned the TV off hours ago, unable to focus, but leaving the lamp on in the living room, its yellow glow felt safer than complete darkness. I wasn't sure why that particular night had unsettled me so much. I'd lived there for years, and storms had come and gone, but something in the atmosphere was different, a restless static in the air. It was around midnight when I walked to the window. The curtains were half open, and through the veil of rain, I could see the streetlights bleeding pale halos across the soaked asphalt. It should have been a comforting sight, ordinary even, but then my eyes shifted. The house next door, my neighbor's place, still had its lights on. That in itself was strange. They usually went to bed early, around 10 or so, and their home always went dark by then. But that night, a faint light leaked through their thin curtains. I squinted, curiosity mixed with unease, and then it happened. He was there. My neighbor, standing perfectly still by his own window, parting the curtains just slightly and looking out. Our eyes met across the gap of pouring rain. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe he too was checking the storm, but he didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, staring straight at me. Not at the street, not into the distance, sat me. A jolt of cold shot down my spine. My fingers twitched against the fabric of my curtain. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. The rain distorted everything. Maybe his gaze only seemed fixed on me. I told myself to breathe, to let go of the thought, and I closed the curtains tightly, cutting off his stare. But the unease didn't vanish. Not 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang. I froze, my stomach tightening into a knot. It was too late for anyone to drop by. My heart began to pound with each echo of the bell, louder and louder as it repeated. Finally, I forced myself to walk to the door. My hand shook as I reached for the peephole. It was him. My neighbor stood on the porch, his coat soaked, water dripping from his hair, shoulders rising and falling as if he'd been standing in the rain a long time. His expression was blank, not hostile, not friendly, just hollow. When I opened the door slightly, he wasted no time. "My phone isn't working," he said, his voice rough, strained. "I think the rain knocked it out. I need to make a call. Can I use yours?" The request sounded reasonable enough, normal, even, and yet everything inside me screamed no. Something in his tone, and the way he looked at me without blinking, made my skin crawl. I hesitated, words caught in my throat. I can't," I finally stammered. "Not right now." He tilted his head just slightly, like a predator trying to read its prey. His eyes lingered on mine far too long before he nodded once, slowly. "All right," he muttered. His voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "Good night." I shut the door before he could say more. But even with the barrier between us, I could feel his stare burning into the wood. I leaned my back against the door, my chest rising and falling rapidly. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. For nearly an hour, I tried to convince myself it was over, that he had returned to his house and gone inside. But as I sat in the living room, the rain pelting the windows, I began to hear it, faint creaks, footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Rain can play tricks, magnifying and warping the smallest sounds. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Slow, deliberate steps across the porch boards, pausing, waiting, then moving again. My throat went dry. I strained my ears, praying for the sound to fade. But instead, it grew closer, pausing right at the front door, and then moving away. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Relief lasted only seconds, though, because out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement in the kitchen window, a shadow. I crept to the window, inching the curtain just slightly. He was there, in the middle of the garden, standing motionless in the pouring rain, his head tilted upward, eyes locked directly on the window. His soaked hair clung to his forehead, water running down his face, but he didn't blink. He didn't move. He just stared. The moment stretched on until my pulse felt like it might explode in my veins. I yanked the curtain shut, backing away quickly. My body shook uncontrollably. And then silence. But silence can be worse than sound, because it meant I had to wait, listening, wondering where he was, what he would do next. Minutes dragged by. My nerves screamed with every creak of the house, every rattle of the storm. And then, as if to remind me he was still there, came the faintest of noises. Not footsteps this time, not knocking. Clicks. Small, sharp clicks, almost like fingernails, tapping lightly against the glass. First on the living room window, then the back door, then the front door. Never steady, never rhythmic, just random, persistent. Testing. The sound went on for hours. My body ached with exhaustion, but I didn't dare move from my place by the couch. It felt like if I closed my eyes, if I let myself drift, he would slip inside. Through the door, through the window, through some opening I hadn't considered. When I finally glanced at the clock, I realized it was nearly dawn. I hadn't slept. My entire body was locked in tension. The rain slowed to a drizzle. I forced myself to the window, pulling the curtain open just a crack. What I saw froze me where I stood. The garden was littered with footprints, dozens of them, deep in the wet mud, not just in the center, but circling every window, standing, pausing, turning. The prints overlapped, some deeper than others, as if whoever made them had stood in place for long stretches, watching. Every window, every door. He had been there all night. When I looked toward his house, the curtains were drawn tight, the lights were off, as though no one had been awake at all. But the prints told me otherwise. The following afternoon, the storm had eased, but my nerves hadn't. I stayed indoors, curtains drawn, unable to shake the memory of the footprints circling my house. Sleep had not come, and even daylight didn't feel safe anymore. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the refrigerator made me flinch. I tried to convince myself that last night had been a nightmare, some trick of exhaustion and fear. But the mud outside my windows told me otherwise. He had been there, and I knew, when darkness fell again, he would return. That evening, the rain came back heavier than before. The wind rattled the gutters, branches scraped against the roof, and the house felt like it was shrinking around me. I locked every door and window, checked each one twice, then sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, waiting. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. For a while, nothing happened. I almost began to believe I had imagined it, all until I heard movement from upstairs. A floorboard creaked, then another. My blood ran cold. I had locked everything. No one should have been inside. I gripped a fireplace poker and forced myself up the stairs. At the end of the hallway, my bedroom door stood half open. The carpet outside was damp, marked with faint drops of water. I pushed the door wider, my throat tight. Lightning flashed, lighting the room for a split second. He was there, sitting in the chair in the corner, soaked, pale, and staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I screamed and swung the poker, catching him across the shoulder. He toppled sideways with a grunt, but I didn't stop to see Mirai bolted. I flew down the stairs, yanked open the front door, and ran barefoot into the storm. Behind me, I could hear him following, his steps heavy and fast, gaining ground as I sprinted into the empty street. Rain blinded me, but I didn't stop. His ragged breathing was close, too close. At one point, I felt his hand brush my shoulder, but adrenaline drove me forward. Somehow, I reached the glowing sign of the police station and stumbled inside, gasping for air. They listened. They sent officers to my house. When they came back, their faces were strange. Calm, almost pitying. "There was no one in your house," one officer said. "No signs of a break, nothing unusual at all." I shook my head, trembling. "No, You don't understand, he was there. He chased me. He touched me. The officer hesitated, then said softly, "Your neighbor, the man you're describing, he died 2 weeks ago. Heart attack. The house has been empty since." The room spun. I couldn't breathe. Dead. But I had seen him, felt him, heard him. And as the rain pounded harder against the station windows, one thought rooted itself deep inside me. If he was dead, then what had followed me out of that house wasn't my neighbor anymore.